A very warm welcome to all of you to this session on dementia care. I'm Mark Wilberforce from PSSRU up at Manchester, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce three what sound like fascinating talks today, and nicely following what Tom was saying earlier on about challenges for dementia care. Just a little bit about the structure. We'll have 15 minutes each for the speakers. I will have some cards to waggle towards you as we get towards the end of time. We have a video-assisted referee to help me if should I need it. And then we'll have some Q&A. And if we get through in good time, then we might be able to have speakers up at the end to have a bit more of a general discussion. Okay, so without further ado, I shall introduce our first speaker, Anne-Marie Towers. She's from the University of Kent, and she'll be speaking to us about her talking mats. Yeah, it's straight there. They're already up.
Brilliant. Right, okay, thanks for having me, everybody. So I'm going to get straight into it because we are very time limited today, and hopefully anything that I've brushed over a bit too quickly, we can pick up again in questions. So before I go into the actual detail about what we've done with Talking Mats, I just want to contextualise it in terms of the project this was done as part of. So it was the Measuring Outcomes of Care Home study, which was funded by the SSCR, and it's a 3-year project due to complete this year. The overarching aims of the project were to look at the relationship between care home residents' outcomes and the new CQC quality ratings. That's not what I'm talking about today, but that was one of the main aims of the overall project. But also more broadly to understand the care-related quality of life of care home residents, including people living with dementia. And to do that, we use the Adult Social Care Outcomes Toolkit, or ASCOT. So the way that we use ASCOT in care homes is that we basically collect evidence about people's care-related quality of life. We do that through conversations with residents, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. We do structured observations of residents in communal areas of the homes, and we also carry out interviews with staff and family members where they're available. And we basically triangulate those different sources of evidence and use that to make informed ratings of people's care-related quality of life. So the ASCOT care homes methodology is very flexible. That was designed intentionally to do that so that it could be as inclusive as possible. We wanted a version of ASCOT that could be used with people with cognitive impairments and communication difficulties. And as such, when we talk to residents, we employ different methods, and we're very flexible about how we go about this. So for some residents, it's a typical structured tick box type interview with response options. So very much self-completion. For other residents, however, we have to use a more semi-structured approach. So we will get some ticks in boxes, but a lot of it will be more qualitative, and some of it will be quite partial information. So there'll be some domains of quality of life that people won't give us any information on. And then with other residents, it becomes even more unstructured. So that even attempting to try and get a tick in a box is not going to work, in which case we will be talking about the here and now. So it may be that while they're having a cup of tea and a biscuit, we talk to them about what the food's like here. Or it may be that when we see family visiting, we come over and introduce ourselves and say, do you spend much time with your family, and have a general chat. So we're very flexible. However, what we have noticed over the last 7 or 8 years using the toolkit in care homes is that we are still missing some people with dementia. We're missing their voice, basically, in our ratings. We're finding them hard to reach with existing methods. So as part of the MOUCH study, we collected data about 293 care home residents. And if you have a look here, you can see that just under 50% of the people who had a formal diagnosis of dementia in our sample had no interviews, that light blue line with 72 people written above it, compared to about 15% of people that didn't have a diagnosis of dementia in the sample. So you can see that, and you can see the opposite pattern for the structured interviews, which is what you would expect, actually. But the worrying sample, the population, are the people who we're not getting their voice at all in those ASCOT ratings, because our methods just aren't able to pick that data up. So we started to explore whether we could use something to aid our communication with care home residents with dementia. And just as an overview, this is a talking mat. So for those of you that aren't familiar, because we weren't until we started this work, it was developed by speech and language therapists, originally at the Stirling, Joan Murphy and colleagues. And it's now run as a social enterprise. It's used across different service user groups, age groups. It's used in educational settings, healthcare settings. It's used a lot by care providers and in care planning. And essentially, you pick a topic, so that's the bottom card, which is where you live, and you have a set of symbols that Talking Mat's team have developed, and you ask the person that you're having a conversation with to place each card at a time under a top scale, which is the top 3 that you've got there. And that top scale, you define that top scale according to what you're talking to the person about, what makes sense. So you might have it happy, not happy, and in the middle, not sure. You could use that middle option as a don't know. So the top scale isn't consistent. It depends on the conversation you're having and what you want to talk to the person about. So this is an example of the original kind of Talking Mat cards that we had available to us. So the first thing that we did, working with Joan Murphy, but also Jill Bradshaw at the Tizard Centre, who is a Talking Mats trainer, we decided that we wanted to use the existing sets that were available to us, that developed by the Talking Mats team, and work out a way of adjusting those or adapting those for Ascot. And Ascot covers 8 domains of quality of life. So we were looking for around 8 or 9 cards to kind of get at those domains of quality of life. And we had to compromise. These were just the cards that were available to us. And this was our basic starting point. We used that Talking Mat with 10 care home residents in the first instance. We managed to get at least partial information for 8 out of 10, which was good, better than we maybe anticipated. And we were focusing on the people that we had not been able to interview in other ways. And some people were people we'd got very unstructured qualitative interviews with. But even within those first 10 interviews, we realised that there were some real issues with that for us with this particular population, particularly around the fact that if I go back, if you have a look here, the characters are very cartoony, almost Simpson-esque. And this was a problem. So our care home residents were consistently saying, oh, it's a little boy, or oh, he's yellow, or he's blue. And we're quite fixated on the fact that if you look at comfort, the person sitting in the chair, oh, he's got no clothes on. And so we were struggling to get past some of the nature of the drawings themselves with some of our residents. There were also issues around some of those symbols just being too complex, not quite working, not quite getting at the domains we wanted to, which wasn't surprising given that we were just making the use of the existing symbol set rather than developing our own at this time. So what we did is we took all this information on board, and we thought, right, what can we look at to try and test some of our theories that actually the characters need to be clothed, they need to be a mix of gender, they need to probably be older people, not looking so much like young boys, which is what they mostly appeared to our residents. And we also wanted to explore how we could get at some of the domains around occupation and social participation a bit better, as this is an area of quite frequently unmet need in care homes. So we did a bit of an interim process before we went about paying and funding for more symbols to be developed. And in this interim phase, we basically looked at some characters that were looked like older people, which we'd pinched from another project I'm involved in. We looked at different ways of conceptualising safety, such as aids and equipment, which was more meaningful perhaps to older people. And we wanted to get to some characters that looked like women, some intergenerational aspects. So we just did a little pilot with 3 more people to see if our hunches were correct and that we needed to make some of these sorts of changes. Definitely clothing worked better. Older adults worked a lot better than those cartoony young boys. We still had issues around abstract thinking, and this was always going to be a challenge, and this was part of the overall kind of process of piloting these interviews. So people would look at the safety one that I had previously. We changed some of the wording on this, by the way, but looking at that image, when we were saying, how safe do you feel? They would say, oh no, there's no steps here, I don't use steps. So they couldn't get past the fact that we were using it as a symbol, they weren't able, because of their level of confusion, they weren't able to use that in an abstract way. So we basically we developed a completely specific symbol set, and we worked with Sterling to do this. We wanted 3 topic cards instead of the usual one. And the reason that we wanted this is because some people were unable, they fixated on some of the concrete things. So, for example, where you live has a red door. I don't have a red door. So that almost stopped the conversation from the very beginning. Some people didn't recognise that they were living in a care home. So if you start the topic with, we're going to talk to you about where you live or living here, you were already putting up a boundary to that conversation because they don't live here. I'm waiting for someone to pick me up. I'm going home in a minute. So we wanted to have an alternative topics, male and female, depending on who we were talking to, so that we could say, I want to talk to you about you. I want to talk to you about you, your life. We expanded the main mat. You're allowed up to 15 symbols on a mat with talking mats. That's their guidance. And you mustn't bombard people with more than that. And we wanted to, so we thought, right, do you know what, we're going to go up to 15. So for some of the ASCOT domains, like food and drink, we've now got 3 related symbols going down. So snacks, food and drink as in meal times, and also menu choices. So we expanded our repertoire of symbols, if you like, to try and get at all the different concepts that sit behind that. And we also developed a second mat. Now, we knew this was ambitious because a lot of residents were going to struggle to do 1 mat, let alone 2. But in an ideal world, we wanted to get more detailed information about how people spend their time so that the information we gather is useful for care home providers and staff. How do people feel about how they spend their time? And we developed these symbols based on our experiences over the last 8 to 10 years with ASCOT, talking to people about how they spend their time in care homes, and from some of the testing we'd already done. So for phase 2, we completed 16 more pilot interviews using these 2 mats. Thank you. Out of the 16 residents that we tried to interview, 6 couldn't do it at all, and I'll talk a bit about why in a minute. 4 could complete the first mat only, and then we made a judgment call that actually that had taken a lot out of them just doing that 1 mat, and enough is enough, we didn't even try a second mat. And 6 people really took to it and completed both mats. When we reflected on those interviews afterwards, we saw a much better balance in conversation. In a conversation, natural conversation with somebody, you would hope that each party would speak equally. And we found, and that's how these interviews work, they're conversational in structure. And we found that these cards helped that conversation balance and that symmetry between the researcher and the respondent. And we also found that where we got the second mat, the information was really valuable and interesting, definitely added something to our knowledge and something that the staff in the care home found quite interesting to have fed back to them. So the key question was, did we reach more residents using this talking mat? So we only tried talking mats with people who either hadn't been interviewed in the traditional way through ASCOT, so we hadn't managed to reach, or had only done a very unstructured, very, very qualitative interview previously. And I think the answer is yes, actually, we certainly did reach more people this way. So we managed to get, if you look there, 11 people did, well, actually 13 people did 1 or 2 mats that we previously had no information for at all. So that's 13 voices that we've managed to include in our ratings and in our research that we wouldn't have otherwise. Interestingly, we actually had altogether 9 failures, if you like, 9 people that couldn't out of the nearly 30 that we interviewed, 29 it was in total. And what was really interesting about that was that 4 people had done a qualitative interview but couldn't do the talking mats. And I'll reflect on that in a minute. So using the talking mat framework, what worked and what didn't. Definitely pictures of older people, definitely having them clothed. That really, really helped our conversations. Topic card choices, having that flexibility about how you introduce the topic. We found that with people with short-term memory issues or recall issues, this works really well, talking mats, because the use of the cards keeps people on track conversationally. It helps them remember what you are talking to them about. And the cards definitely give structure to conversations that otherwise could go off on a tangent. It keeps both you as an interviewer and the person responding on track with those conversations. Symbols still need work. We had several concerns around the symbols. I think some of the reasons that the interview sometimes failed is because the cards are quite small. So we use the standard Talking Mats card sizes, which are smaller than a playing card, really. They're not as tall. And actually a lot of our older people in care homes have massive sensory impairments. And I think sometimes they were misunderstanding or struggling to look at the symbol, not necessarily because the picture was wrong, but because they couldn't see it clearly. So I think we'd need, if we were going to take this forwards in the future, we would need to look at much bigger cards for this particular group. And I think some of the symbols themselves are maybe a little bit complex still. What didn't work, some residents, you know, they've got very advanced dementia, and they have lost the ability to do that abstract thinking. They can't take a symbol and use this symbolically to represent how they feel. So what they would do instead is describe the person in the picture. Oh yes, she looks really happy, and put her under the thumbs up. So the resident would get the task, they would put it under the right top scale that made sense, but they would be reporting for the person in the picture rather than for themselves. Some people were too disorientated in time and space, so they would maybe talking a lot about the past rather than the present. Length of 2 mats, yes, it was helpful, but it's probably a bit ambitious for most residents. And we still have some concerns of perseverance for some residents, so were they consistently just putting it under the happy box? Okay, that's it. I've finished. Next steps and the disclaimer. So this is my views and not those of the NIHR, SSCR or the Department of Health.
Sorry, I didn't know it was going to beep quite like that. Do we have a steward for the mic? Would you? Oh, you've got one. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Emery. Do we have any questions? If you could just say who you are and where you're from, help us put you in context. Thanks.
Thanks. This is really exciting to see how it's moved and to think that there's more ways that we can include more people in research. I was wondering whether for the people there were people who completed both the interview and the talking mats. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about whether you found there were consistent answers across the two.
Well, what I didn't have time to tell you was the next stage. Thank you very much, Adeline. This next stage of our, we only just started looking at this data. We've got until the end of the year to write it up. So we're actually going to be looking at that comparison. So those that we've got, because so many of them we had no interview data on, we won't be able to, but there is this small subgroup that we've got both. And that will be the next thing that we're going to be looking at. That and looking at their level of communication and how that affected how much they could tell us. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Margaret Blake from Ipsos Mori. I was wondering whether these new mats that you've developed will become part of the ones that they have in the social enterprise in Stirling and will be available for others to use, or whether they're just specific to this project.
Well, that does need some sorting out. So we had to pay for the development of these, and because we were doing it as part of Ascot, and the plan was if this was a huge roaring success, we might need to integrate Talking Mats and Ascot together and bring the two toolkits together in some way. So that's something that we're going to need to explore in more options with Stirling, I think, and see what they want to do. I don't think we'd have any objection to people using the symbols in the future. It's silly to, for other people to have to develop the resource again. But I know that both Ascot now by the University of Kent and Talking Mats is all copyrighted, and so I think there's going to have to be some sort of agreement put in place between the universities. But we certainly would have no objection to people using the symbols. Yeah.
Thank you.
Got time for one more, if.
It's really interesting. I think the broader question that occurs to me, and it's slightly outside your research really, but it's the way of finding different ways of communicating. And you've tried to use a pictorial method with the talking mats, but one knows that, for example, music is very important to people, and one just wonders, and I'm sure there must be work going on actually, about how one might use that in a structured way that could be developed to get responses from people that perhaps this method, the visual method, isn't working for some. Maybe there's another route through that means.
Yeah. Well, there's been lots of work. Done by the Music and Memory team, which are originally based in America, but it's now across Europe. It's starting to get used in the UK, which is around, it sort of taps into the Playlist for Life type thing, but it was actually before Playlist for Life, Music and Memory. And the idea is that you find music that's meaningful for that person, and that you can put it on a playlist or a headphones or whatever, and that actually when you do that, you can look it up on YouTube, you can put music from memory, and when you play that music, you see the person go through some sort of awakening. And so what sometimes it's being used by some care providers to do now is that where the person is almost like locked in and no longer communicative, they will play the music that they found works for that person, and then the person will become responsive, and the care staff can have a conversation with that person. So a person that previously wouldn't have been able to tell them any information suddenly can have a very basic conversation and share their views. So I think this is something that could be really interesting to explore in the future, about how you could bring music into your, almost like as a mechanism for helping the person engage with other conversations. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma. So continuing our theme of communication in dementia, I'm delighted to welcome on the stage Justine Schneider, Professor Health and Social Care at Nottingham, and award-winning cartoonist, Tony Husband.
Thank you, Mark. So, do we put this up ourselves then, or is somebody going to do the magic?
It should be a continuous sequence.
Oh, lovely. Yes, that's us. Super. Can you hear me all right at the back? Yeah, you're nodding. Great. I'm here to tell you about a project that was conceived by us at Nottingham and funded by the School for Social Care Research to look at the livelihoods of people delivering home care for people with dementia. The question was, what is it that makes good home care for people with dementia? And it was an ethnographic study that we undertook in 16 and 17, where we sent 2 ethnographers into the field as home carers doing the research. That's Lucy Perry-Young and Samantha Wilkinson. They went into the field and spent 10 months working as home carers and brought back loads and loads of field notes. In all, there were about 360 episodes of care that they delivered and recorded. And in addition to that, we had diaries kept by 11 home care workers over about 4 months. So we had masses of data which the research team and I all read and reread and absorbed. And at the end of it, we wanted to represent it to the home care workers themselves in particular in a format that was authentic, true to life, meaningful and easy to engage with. And so I had a long-held ambition to produce a graphic novel telling the story of home care for people with dementia. And I was absolutely delighted when Tony accepted my invitation, because I'm sure many of you are familiar with Tony's beautiful book called Take Care, Son. Is this where you pull out a copy and wave it in the air? Ta-da! If you haven't seen it, it's just absolutely magical, and I hope that you will read it. So I sat down with the research team to develop the characters that were going to have a role in this graphic novel, and it was really quite easy and lots of fun for us to agree on some archetypes, really, some people who we all recognise. They weren't actually modelled on any of the individuals whom we'd observed in our study, but they were very similar in many ways to those people, and they combined many of the characteristics that one sees time and time again in care in the community. And so we wrote backstories for each of these individuals, and here here's the backstory for Frida. We very much wanted the story to be written from the perspective of the cat because we'd observed that pets were terribly important in the lives of the people we were visiting. But we also wanted everyone in the book to have some authenticity, and therefore once we'd written the biographies of the individuals, Tony drew up the characters themselves as cartoons. I don't know if you want to say something now about how you took this on. Yeah?
Okay. Hi everyone. I got these scripts from Justine, and they were like wonderful because they were people I knew, and I got the characters. I mean, the cat was wonderful. I love drawing cats anyway. I've done a couple of books on cats, and cats are very proud, very independent animals. I mean, in ancient Egypt, cats were known as gods, were worshipped as gods, and cats would never forgot that. So cats just sort of a really good base to draw an observer. So I was able to draw all these characters from people I knew. Daisy, the carer, was someone I knew who was passionate, absolutely absorbed in care, and gave a life to it, but also very busy, dashing around, trying to do everything everywhere. And then Jim and Janet were people I knew. I think Janet was my dad, because my dad had dementia. So I drew Janet and thinking about my dad. It was easy to get involved with these people and become part of their lives. And I kind of drew it over a long time, but I kind of looked forward to meeting them and seeing what they were going to do today, and then another script would arrive. So I would send Justine the roughs of the script, and she would say, yeah, that's fine, or can we change this? The initial Jim, I did him was quite upright, quite sort of fit, and then I drew the whole thing, didn't I, with Jim being quite fit, and did them all in colour, finished the job, and then Justine came back and said, well, showing it the carers, and they don't think Jim should be quite fit, so I had to redraw every Jim, which was fun. But so Jim then had hip problems, and he had a walking stick. But it was just great to get into the characters of these people because I knew them all. There's Daisy with the two children who she had to leave at home all the time, who fed themselves because she was dashing around and I was stuck in traffic or waiting to get back from one meeting to the next meeting. And so she had a life. They all had lives outside the dementia and the care. So that was that's where I came from.
So we also, this is an example of a kind of storyboard that we put together. We decided the book would have a number of chapters with 16 frames in each chapter, and each chapter tells a separate narrative, but they're all linked together. The lives of Frida lives next door to Jim and Janet. Frida's got early dementia, Janet's is more advanced, and Daisy is the home care worker who moves between the two households, but so does Winston the cat. And this is an example of the rough that Tony would send me, and we would send it back with tips and requests.
And spelling mistakes. I'm a really bad speller, so I'd get back, you spelled cat wrong, and it's like...
Well, the book's far from perfect, and actually we think less is more. That there's you can spot the typos in it if you don't want to do anything else. But this was the first image that Tony produced, and we could see from this that he'd got it immediately. And once he'd drawn up a couple of chapters, we had a meeting with some very respected home care workers, 4 people who were recommended by their agencies as superior home care workers, to talk to them about where's this going, what changes might be needed here. And one of the things that they told us was actually in an early version of the first story, Daisy barges into the kitchen and introduces herself to Frida, and they told us that no, actually we would never cross the threshold until we'd been invited in. So Tony had to change that drawing too. And we also made the kitchen a little bit more dishevelled. If you notice the difference between this one and this one, we had to demonstrate there was a bit of disorganisation going on here.
There's
even
also
before.
the small things like the birds. She used to feed the birds, but then she forgot to feed the birds, so the birds are looking in saying, "Where's our food?" and it's not coming. It's not coming.
And the cat's getting beans for his dinner as well. Yeah. That's something. So every single image repays quite a bit of observation and reflection, and this is what's intended is so that people will use it for training purposes and awareness raising purposes, dwelling on each picture, discussing each picture. And if you put 4 home carers in front of any one of these images, you will generate a really interesting conversation about what's happening, what's going on, what would be good care in this particular situation. So we've actually published all of this in a book and included in the book some prompts for discussion. What's each character thinking? How does this scene relate to your experience? And how do you handle similar situations? And in an ideal world, what would Daisy do next? And we think from our limited experience that will engage the sorts of people who are actually doing this work day to day, and in that way help them to acknowledge their own good practice and to improve through learning from others. And it touches on some really big, important issues. For example, this is my favourite drawing because it's the bill for home care. We were working in our study with agencies for which people paid themselves. They weren't funded by local authorities. And we are all familiar, I'm sure, with the anxiety that the cost of home care causes people. So that's a major issue that's worth looking into.
And I've just realised the cat there is white. I forgot to colour him in by the looks of it.
Oh, well, that's one for the next edition. Yeah.
He's had a shock in that one. But
we're very interested in the tricks of the trade, the skills that individual home carers use to persuade people to do things that they don't want to do. You know, Janet's obstinately refusing to get dressed. So in a room full of home carers, how do you deal with this situation? What do you do? What works for you? And our ethnographic notes had quite a bit on difficult relatives, actually. I don't know if it was just our researchers who found them problematic, but we introduced this rather brash solicitor son of Jim and Janet who breezes in and criticises the home carer
and the dog.
And his horrible dog, yes, who's Winston's mortal enemy. So all of these are issues that are actually grounded in the research, which have been brought into the narratives, and we present them here as a means for people to reflect on practice. And the book was delivered on Friday, thank goodness. I have a few copies here for sale. It's also downloadable for free at the URL on the bottom of this slide. The cost of the book is just to repay the printing costs, and I have about 10 copies if anybody wants to take one home or to give one as a gift to your favourite home carer. Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything?
No, basically it was just a lovely project to work on, and getting to know the characters, and hopefully this will give people who care a voice so that people understand what they have to do, what they have to go through to do this every day. And it's a challenge, but the dedicated, wonderful people who give their lives to people with dementia, and yes, to applaud those as well, really, and that's basically what it was about. So thank you.
Would you be okay to answer a few questions? I'm sure there will be some, so just fourth row.
Thanks very much. Have I got this right? Rachel Hughes from Goldsmiths. Absolutely loved that. And I was just sitting here thinking of another cartoon or drawn book with cats, so the Mog books, Judith Kerr's Mog books. Because when I saw that picture of the kitchen, it just made, the thing I love about the Mog books is that the kitchen's always really messy, which is very nice when you're reading it as a mum to your children, thinking my kitchen looks like that. And that made me think, I wonder, have you shown it to any of the people with dementia, and as well as the home carers? And I was wondering how they might relate to it.
No, we haven't had a chance to. What would you suggest we should do with it?
Well, I just thought maybe they might relate to it in a positive way, and it could be a really nice thing for them to look at with their home carers.
Well, that's great. I volunteer at a memory cafe, so I'll take a copy along.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
That's brilliant. I'm going to buy a copy of your book. I just wondered, Justine, how did you organise it, the project, the BOUGH project more generally, to have researchers working as home care workers? Was that difficult to set up from a kind of pragmatic point of view? And how did you get that through ethics? And were there any issues that came up because of it?
Ethics wasn't too much of a problem because we could justify it on the grounds that we don't know anything about home care for people with dementia. People are vulnerable, and it's a growing area. So I think ethics, although we had carefully to go through the ethical process and have all of the protocols in place, it was relatively unproblematic. We were very fortunate to be working with a very good home care agency. We decided that we wanted to look at good home care, and so we could go approach agencies and say, this is what we want to show people is your good practice. So there was we tried to dispel any fears that maybe we were going to be whistleblowing or criticising people. Even so, we had to hand over a lot of power to the managers of the agency, and they basically they determined which clients were invited to participate in the study, which carers were invited to be interviewed. So they did have quite a lot of influence over what we heard. And yeah, that was the price we paid for access.
Thank you.
I had one as well. It's just about how we'll know how this is being used in the future, and whether or not there's any plans for follow-up evaluation, thinking about how it's implemented in practice or used.
Well, we'll be counting the downloads.
Yeah.
And somebody here from the UK Home Care Association. Is Michelle in the room? Did you get here? Hope. Or maybe she's coming later. Maybe she's gone to another session. But we're hoping that they'll help us publicise it too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll be lining up for a copy, and not having coloured in one of the cats, when it's in its second edition and you do colour it in, these will be worth a fortune. So I think well worth making a purchase. Oh, hello. You're already here. I'm very pleased to introduce Kritika Samsi from King's College London, who will now talk about the admission to care home and social workers' roles. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's nearly afternoon, so I think I can get away with saying that. I'm Kritika Samsi. I work in the Social Care Workforce Research Unit, and I'm very honored to be here today to talk to you about a study that has been funded by the School for Social Care Research. We're doing the research with Jill Manthorpe based at the unit, and I just wanted to acknowledge the work of Laura Cole, who's done most of the work on the study and will be answering all of the difficult questions after I'm done. I tend to talk really fast, and I have what seems like a frightening number of slides, but I really just want to get through the background and the methodology, and happy to answer any questions because we did it as rigorously as possible, but I want to dwell on the findings because we think that's the most interesting bit of the study at the moment, and I just want to give you a broad perspective of all the findings that we've got. Some apologies if I go through it quite quickly. Happy to take any questions at the end, over lunch, or even just to be emailed at any time in the future about anything that you find particularly noticeable. So just to start with a bit of background, we started this study because we felt that moving to a care home can be quite a difficult decision for people with dementia and carers. It came up in a lot of research that studies don't seem to include people with dementia in this decision-making process sometimes. The word placed came up quite a bit rather than moving to a care home, where people talk about placing someone and it being done to people with dementia rather than involving them in the decision itself. So we were quite curious about whether this was a field we could explore, and sure enough it was. And we wanted to kind of hone in on whether there was, if any, an optimal time for a person with dementia to be moved to a care home, alongside using their wishes, their decision-making, and asking the range of people who were involved in this decision-making process. This came up as a priority area determined by the Alzheimer's Society and the James Lind Alliance, identified it as a priority area. And so we went with applying to the Social Care School for Social Care Research, and we got funding for a 3-year study that started about 2 years ago. So the aims of this 3-year study, it's a 3-part, 3-year multi-method study looking at principally what might be the factors that affect an individual's decision to move into a care home. We wanted to explore what the drivers of the decision might be, who might be involved in the decision, and how it kind of evolved. And we particularly wanted to focus on what may be considered an optimal time, if any. If there was a particular time people talked of as being either the best time for having moved into the care home while they reflect on when they had actually moved. So like I said, it's a 3-part study. The first part was a systematic review, which we've completed, and it's in press in International Psychogeriatrics. Laura Cole is the lead author on it, so look for Cole et al. In the journal soon. The second part, which is what I'll be talking about today, is a set of qualitative interviews that we did looking at the retrospective experiences of people with dementia who moved into a care home and asking them to reflect on the move, as well as asking their carers about how it all kind of came about, focusing mainly on the timing issue, to reflect on what the timing of the move may have been and how that kind of worked out for them. Today, I'm going to be talking about the interviews we conducted with social workers. We also asked social workers and care home managers about the experiences that they had had with people with dementia being moved into a care home, and just reviewing what that experience had been like, who had been involved in the decision making, how it had evolved, focusing mainly on the timing and what may be an optimal time to move to a care home. And the next part, which we're now working on developing, is a factorial survey, which kind of moves on from using our qualitative findings to pick on discrete factors, to develop a factorial survey and a series of vignettes, which we're in the process of rolling out right now, and hopefully we'll have more information for everyone in the next conference, hopefully. Right, so the qualitative interviews, like I said, is part 2 of the study, which is what we're nearly completing, and the social worker interviews are the ones I'm focusing on for this presentation. We interviewed 20 social workers from 3 local authorities. In terms of diversity, most of them were female. We had 2 men in the sample. It was quite a diverse ethnic group, but a lot of white British participants, and 5 of the 20 social workers worked in hospitals. The rest were all community-based. We're working towards getting more in the other samples, but like I said, I'm just focusing on this group right now. Right, and I just wanted to mainly focus on the findings. So there were 3 main findings that kind of evolved from the qualitative interviews that we did. We've just used a process of thematic analysis to draw out what these findings may be, and this is still at an emerging stage. So we're just presenting what might be emerging findings, and I'm going to be focusing on the 3 main findings that we've kind of identified from these transcripts. The first was the factors social workers talked about as being considered during decision making, the ones that they felt that they were considering when they were doing this. They talked about the completeness of the care package, they talked about wishes of a person with dementia, and they talked about the risks and safety that they kind of evaluated. Almost all social workers, as you can imagine, talked about whether they had considered all the alternatives to keep a person with dementia living in their own home for as long as possible. They talked about telecare, some talked about Canary, which was a system where a social worker could say how many times someone had been visiting and where the person with dementia had been in which room. They talked about multiple visits and night visits, trying to see whether all of these kind of packages of care had been put in place so a person with dementia could be kept in their home for as long as possible. And many of them also talked about the value of a day center and seeing whether that could alleviate some of the stress and enable a person with dementia to live in their home. Risks and safety were a very high priority for most social workers. They talked about evaluating this in relation with a person's wish to stay at home and constantly having to weigh up which was a safe risk to take and an unsafe risk to take, and weigh up what was a valuable way to kind of move forward. Many of them talked about risk in relation to mobility, but also risks with wandering. So this social worker says she, a person with dementia, was so vehement about wanting to stay at home that we had to do all in our power to keep her at home, even if it meant things like she did fall down the stairs because she refused to put her proper slippers on. We knew that was a risk, but we knew that she actually wanted to stay at home right the way through. So I was very reluctant to move her. So social workers were constantly weighing up whether or not it was a risk they wanted to take and what the risk of moving the person may be in relation to them maybe falling down the stairs, as in this case. The wishes of the person with dementia were always integral to a lot of their work, and they said it was their guiding principle. They tried their best to keep the wishes of the person in the center of all the decisions that they were making. A lot of them talked about wishing that people had kind of stated preferences and wishes before they may have lost capacity to do so at the time of having to move into a care home. So this social worker says, personally, I think it would be really nice if people were looking into a care home option at an earlier stage. Family relatives haven't talked about the future, especially not in relation with the person. They just kind of try to not really use the dementia word. In lots of studies I've done before, this has come up, where people are, carers and family members are quite nervous about bringing up these issues, and they talk about it, but not specifically in relation to their relative having dementia, and to consider the future and consider wishes and preferences of potentially moving to a care home in the future. And social workers said that kind of became quite a big obstacle when they needed to make that decision. And I just wanted to talk about the second theme, which was about the process of the move. Almost all of the social workers we talked about this driving, overriding principle about keeping the person with dementia in their own home as far as possible. None of them thought the care home was the best option. They said for some it was not a bad option, but keeping them in their own home for as long as possible almost always was a benefit, was an overriding principle of the way they wanted to work. And this kind of seemed to be like the process with which they moved forward. So we've delineated the themes on the basis of this, and I'll just talk you really quickly through them. As you can imagine, an assessment of needs was the first starting point for people deciding whether a person with dementia needed to move to a care home. Often, this included a capacity assessment where it was relevant, where it might seem the person with dementia did not have capacity to make these decisions and needed a formal assessment to be able to kind of determine this. Along the next stage, respite was considered by a lot of social workers as quite a good stepping stone. Respite services, as well as waiting lists, to broach this topic and encourage family members and people with dementia to consider moving into a care home. So the social worker says, we say to them, go in for a week, I'll come in a couple of times during that week, we will talk about it, and I promise you at the end of that week, we'll go back home and we'll keep talking about it. I think respite is a really, really useful way. You can't talk with somebody in their own home about going into residential care because they just can't picture it. It fills them with fear and they don't understand it. So this social worker felt very much that she used respite as that stepping stone to try it out, see what it's like, and then we'll keep talking about it and consider a permanent move if it's appropriate. Similarly, the next stage was kind of encouraging people to visit potential care homes and ask people to see what it's like, to get a feel for the place, and ask people. Lots of social workers said they didn't themselves do it. Brokerage firms sometimes might, and people with dementia who didn't have friends or family might need a social worker to do it for them, but most often friends and family took over at that stage to visit a care home, to allay any concerns they had, to talk with the care home manager and kind of see what might be a useful care home, appropriate care home for their relative to move into. And in terms of choosing a care home, a social worker said they encourage people to get a feel for the place, and they all almost referred to how the media sometimes painted too negative a picture about care homes, and that wasn't always the case. So they encourage family members and people with dementia to actually visit these care homes, get a feel for it, talk to people, go on the CQC website, read about reviews, and actually make an informed decision rather than based on just the negativity around a care home move, because sometimes a care home move might be the most appropriate thing for a person with dementia who needed it. So this one says, yeah, a lot of people are very anxious about what they see on television and what happens to people. So we just say kind of make an informed decision about this, allay any concerns you have, and get a feel for the place. So the making the decision, a lot of people, no one could actually talk about what the issue was. They said person with dementia being ready for the move. It was hard to determine what that meant, but they said there was a time at which the person with dementia was ready for the move, and that was quite a good time to kind of broach the topic and encourage carers to think about it. Often there was the best interest decision meeting and multidisciplinary team meeting was had. Lots of times social workers in hospitals talked about they had to balance conflict with the family. Like this one says, sometimes you will have family members that ring up and they want to take the lead with everything. And actually, is it appropriate for them? Yes, they're the next of kin and it's important that we keep them involved. But at the end of the day, the person we are discharging should be at the heart of the process. So they felt very much that making a best interest decision for the person with dementia was at the heart of what they did, not necessarily everyone else's opinions. And settling in, again, this was the next stage. Many social workers said they did a 6-week review. They talked to people about settling in, and care home workers were very integral in how people with dementia moving into a care home settled into it and made it their home. As you can imagine, personal belongings, photos, furniture kind of ease that transition and settle people with dementia into their new home much easier. And finally, we really asked them a lot about whether they felt there was an optimal or best time. everyone said this is a very complex decision to kind of time. It is so highly subjective and so difficult to, it's so individual. So it's hard to kind of say what might be a good time for anyone, because some might be more useful at an earlier stage, for some it may be at the later stage. And they all talked about when the person with dementia was ready, or when they realized they can't cope and a care home move was appropriate for them. So we kind of weighed up whether or not they felt that moving during an earlier stage of their condition was better, or the later stage was better. Many said, there were divergent views about this. Some social workers said that having awareness was useful, so that the person with dementia could have an input into the decision and they could potentially settle in to their new home a little bit better. Limited awareness might actually hamper the settling in and make them a little bit more distressed. So the social worker says, I think it's better to give them the opportunity to adapt into such an environment, and they really do sometimes. However, eligibility for local authority funding was more problematic for someone who might want to move in earlier in the condition, and this was a little bit easier for self-funders. Similarly, moving in during later stages, some social workers felt that a limited awareness may be beneficial, as awareness was a little more minimized, so the distress could be minimized a little bit more. But they talked about wait for a trigger to move in, but avoid the crisis. So kind of time it really sharply and really well, which was a very, very difficult thing to do. Some social workers felt that it might be a de-skilling environment for older people. So this one says, moving in too early and you're de-skilling someone, a lot of homes, they do things for you. You're in a 24-hour living environment where they get you up at a certain time, they make tea for you, they make lunch for you. You don't really have that environment. So moving in early may not necessarily be beneficial for someone who is actually quite capable of looking after themselves independently, and the environment might actually lead to a little bit more of de-skilling of their resources. Many of them talked about the finances, driving the decision for whether or not, at what point to move in. And social workers said they were rarely involved in this. They referred them to a finance team, but they discussed what the thresholds were, what the court of protection orders were around it. And many of them felt that there was a more limited choice if people with dementia were solely funded by the local authority. All of them felt that I think a lot more people are aware these days that social care isn't free, which I think they felt in the past many people had assumed, and they are going to be financially assessed. And savings are expected to pay for their own care. But understandably, people do get very upset about that and feel that it's very unfair. They came up with that a lot, and they had to deal with that a lot from family carers as well as people with dementia. So finally, many social workers were dealing with this tremendous responsibility about actually weighing up risk, weighing up might be an optimal time, weighing up family members' opinions, weighing up the interests of the person with dementia as well as the best interest of the person with dementia. Lots of these factors that they were weighing up constantly to make a decision to advise someone with dementia to move into a care home. And there was a huge emotional toll to them. They constantly said they went home, they reflected about this, they constantly felt that they were dealing with the emotional burden, guilt of whether or not they'd done the right thing. They talked about acknowledging that working in the best interest of the person with dementia was sometimes necessary, even if it might mean overriding the wishes of the person. But many times these best interest decision-making sessions actually did result in a positive outcome, where the person did eventually settle in much better than they had when they were at home. And costs came up where they talked about, although it didn't and shouldn't include need or the timing, it did affect the choice. So a lot of people who didn't have the money and wanted to move in earlier were limited by the choices of care homes that they could move into, and were deterred because they knew that the money would run out at a point where local authority funding would need to come in. Right? Thank you to our funders. I realize I've gone really quickly through all the findings, but I am happy to take any questions now and in the future and even over lunch. But as a disclaimer, I'd like to say thank you to the funders, but this is just independent research, and the views here are just the authors and the findings we've come up with, not the views of the NIHR, NHS. Thank you.
Fantastic. Do we have some questions? Excellent.
Hello, my name is Richard Banks. Thank you very much for that. Did the issue of protecting or supporting carers, particularly partner carers, come up in the decision-making processes that you investigated?
Protecting a safety.
Well, I'm thinking particularly of situations where there's a partner who is looking after a person in their own home, and part of the decision making about whether the person needs to go into a residential home is about protecting the carer from health and health difficulties themselves by having to look after someone that they really can't cope with.
Or do you? Yeah.
Should we just get them?
Yeah. Laura, do you want to come? Oh, okay, we can give the mic to Laura, but you can also come up because you've done most of the work.
Would you mind coming up? Because I'm not sure. If you did the work, then it's only fair.
Hello, yes, so I'm Laura, who worked on the study with Kritika. Yes, that was one of the issues. So obviously, if there was no particular issues going against the wishes of the person with dementia, one of the other issues was the coping ability of the carer, maybe the family carer at home. So that would have been one of the main issues for the social worker. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Donna O'Brien. I work for a charity called Seeability, which supports people with learning disabilities, but I used to work with people with Parkinson's, and really echo Richard's comment there about carers being able to cope. How honest do you think people were about, social workers were about the financial pressures? Because one of the things that used to come up a lot with people with Parkinson's was that they were told there was a financial limit on the amount of support they would be given at home, and therefore that actually they couldn't, they'd have to move into a care home because actually there was a cap on the amount of home care provided, particularly respite overnight care for carers, so people would want to stay at home, the carers would want them to be able to stay at home, but the finances weren't there to actually support that respite care. So actually, in the end, they had to sort of move. And I just wondered how honest you felt it was really about the financial limitations of being able to support somebody at home if they were actually local authority funded.
So many of the social workers were quite frustrated actually about the limitations of care for people with dementia at home, and they wished that they could do more. But obviously the decisions that they make have to go to the funding panel, and so they tried very hard to work with many different agencies, multidisciplinary teams, to make sure they had justification for what they were asking for in terms of care packages at home. But obviously they have to work within those limitations. So when they couldn't, sometimes it was like they had a maximum for the care package at home, and once that was no longer sustainable, then a move to a care home would have to be the next choice. But their definite wish that they could do more, but there was limited choices now and dwindling choices as well, with daycare, day centres being taken away from them as an option as well.
Hello, I work for a local authority, and there's two comments I wanted to make. I was quite interested in this concept of using respite as a kind of trial to see if someone liked living, in a care home setting. And that seems a luxury that's certainly not available to anybody that's funded by the local authority. So often, I wouldn't confuse respite with emergency placements either. So respite is normally for someone that has a carer. So they might have slightly more choice, but it's quite unusual for someone to be able to even go to the same place for respite. So we certainly wouldn't, go for a week, see if you like it sort of thing. It's not something that actually happens in reality. And the second point I wanted to make is that you're almost portraying it as if there is just a clear one move from home to care home, when in reality people often travel through quite a lot of care settings. So especially people with dementia may go to some sort of supported living, sheltered housing, which at the time is sold as that they can cope with dementia, when in effect they can't, they're moved on. They may go to residential care and then become physically unwell and move to a care home. So it's interesting that no one mentioned the role of housing in this, and how, you know, how we're building accommodation that can be with people throughout their whole care journey.
That's a very good point. Yes, it is a very linear picture. We did sample, we made it quite a small, tight little study, so we did only look at people who moved from their own homes into a care home setting. So yes, there is a very messy kind of pathway for a lot of other people with dementia especially, but we didn't look at that. We did see only people, even for the people with dementia and carers, we did only interview people who'd moved directly from their own home into a care home, and did ask social workers only their views about that kind of direct linear move, which, like you said, is not representative at all of everyone who may have been going through this process.
Respite.
Oh yeah.
In terms of respite, there were one or two social workers that spoke about respite, that they that they prefer to use that as a sort of stepping stone, particularly if it was people with dementia living at home on their own, as opposed to having a carer. So they didn't know maybe what living in a care home would be like. So there was obviously, as you said, it was just one or two views that was used. But interestingly, in our other interviews as well with family carers, they have used respite in that way as well. So what we need to look at then more carefully is about the funding aspect of that, and how realistic that will be for those who are funded by the local authority, which we will come to do as we're still recruiting for that part of the study.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That was really cool. We've actually, before you get too comfy, we have a few minutes left where I wondered if we might like to get the speakers to come up and sit over here. Tony's looking at me appalled. But would the speakers mind coming up and joining here? And we can field any questions for the last sort of 5-10 minutes or so that you haven't had chance to ask. Also, if there are any particularly want to prompt a bit of any sort of carers or other people in the audience who haven't had a chance to ask a question, I'd like to encourage that as well. But
hi there, this is a question re talking mats. My background is in special education, where we use symbols, widget symbols a lot. So I just wondered the relation between what schools use, widget symbols, and talking mats.
Well, I'm not a talking mats expert, so this was the first time that we'd had an experience. My understanding, can you hear me okay? My understanding is that talking mats is used a lot actually in education. It's used with children with communication difficulties and learning disabilities, but it's also used with young adults. I mean, it's used really widely and internationally. So I'm sure there's an awful lot of overlap between what you're using and the talking mat itself. In a sense, it was developed by speech and language therapists, and then it sort of grew. And I think what they've done is that, and I can relate to this a little bit because of the work that we've done around Ascot. I think that what started off as a device that they used for their own purposes, I think it grew and grew and grew, and more people became interested, and they had to find a model to support other people to use it. And that's why it became a sort of social enterprise, which I think has worked for them. So, yes, I think there's probably an awful lot of overlap with what you're used to using. Yeah.
Just on the fourth row here.
So, for a question for Kritika, I was just wondering if any of the social workers talked about how they communicated with the people with dementia around that decision, because actually one of the things we teach is for people to use talking mats with people with dementia for that decision. So yeah, just wondered if anything came up about people using alternative augmentative communication.
They didn't talk about using talking math.
No.
And they did talk a lot more about the family's involvement and the carer. So they did talk a lot more about the person with dementia not actually being involved in the decision and being at a stage where they are quite late to make these decisions, which is why the social worker said a lot about if they just stated preferences a little earlier, it would make things easier. So no, they didn't talk about using a diverse array of communication strategies that would have kind of got their decision a little bit more.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
It was quite at a late stage of their condition.
Hello, this is a question for Kritika. I'm Madeline Nike. I'm from the PSSRU at Kent. I'm always interested in the practitioner's experience, and thank you very much for researching that and giving your presentation today. Having been a practitioner myself, I'm very interested in whether there was any difference between the hospital practitioners and the community practitioners, particularly about time pressures and expectations from family members as well when trying to place someone in care?
Yes, there was. We only had 5 hospital social workers.
Yeah.
So they did, the way they kind of approached it was a little bit different. Lots of hospital social workers, once they had moved a person with dementia into a care home, didn't necessarily do the 6-week review. There was less continuity of care because they were kind of transferred back into the community, and a community team took over. And there was pressures in that they did feel more like they needed to make a decision about where they moved and didn't have the luxury of time in the flexible way that a community team might have had. And a lot of the ones about choosing respite or thinking of waiting lists as a way to kind of consider these options was obviously from the community team, where they had the luxury of time a little bit more. And again, like I said, it is quite a linear representation of people who don't have a crisis happening as they're talking, as the interviewers they're talking. It's really just a luxury of time kind of model of how the decision making kind of panned out.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll have the last question. So actually, I've got a question for Tony, if I can, and thinking beyond perhaps the study you're just involved with, but I'm interested in anything you've learned over the last however long that you've been using cartoons for, especially in relation to dementia, how people with dementia themselves and carers, so outside practice, have interacted with them.
It's been fantastic, really, and the people with dementia have responded really well. It's a lovely way of communicating for them. I remember going to a care home, and this lady said she came with a carer, and she came and asked me. I was doing it. It's called a cartoon confessional, where I take people's confessions, draw them, and hand them back, and they're redeemed. So there were all these wonderful stories coming out, and this lady came to me, and she said, and it was nothing to do with the confession. She just said, "I miss my cat." So I said, "Oh, really?" So I said, "What does it look like?" So she said, "It's ginger." So I said, "Well, I've only got a black and white pen, but does it look like this?" And I drew the cat for her, and she just went, "My cat's come home." And she grabbed me and gave me a big hug, and she said, "I'm going to put this on the wall." And the carer just went like that. It was just a simple way of just reaching her, really. Mm-hmm. And it's like music. My dad could play music right to the very end, but also he could draw, and it was a communication. And I think it's a wonderful way. It's a simple way. The mats are wonderful. The way they take care, some book has helped carers, and it's used in care homes as a guide. It's just a simple, easy way to explain the story without having to read lots of text. Mm-hmm. And I think that is important, really.
Fantastic. Right, we've reached the end of the session, and I'm sure our speakers will be delighted to speak to you over lunch or during the rest of the day. But for now, can we give them a very warm round of applause? Thank you very much.